The rooftop was too crowded for the kind of night I'd wanted. I had pictured quiet corners, low voices, the kind of conversation you could forget about the next morning. She had other plans. We'd barely stepped off the elevator before she'd loosened her scarf, turned on that smile, and started weaving us through clusters of people like she owned the place. I was still nursing my first drink when it happened. The guest speaker was halfway through thanking the donors when she drifted toward me with a glass of red. One moment it was steady in her hand, the next it was tipping, the arc too smooth to be an accident. The wine hit the edge of my glass, sloshed over my knuckles, and cascaded onto the speaker's notes. A startled hush fell over the group around us. She covered her mouth in mock horror then, before anyone could offer a napkin, laughed. "He always finds a way to be the center of attention," she said, projecting her voice just enough for the nearby tables to hear. The room obliged with polite laughter, but it didn't feel spontaneous. It felt prepared. She didn't look at me after that. Her eyes moved like a lens, sweeping the space, checking expressions, tracking who was watching. Not me, never me, but the ripples I made. I wiped my hand on the edge of a cocktail napkin and let the sound of their laughter fade. In my pocket, my fingers closed around the vintage brass key that had been on my keyring since my father passed. Smooth edges, worn flat in places from years of turning locks. I'd always thought of it as ballast, weight that kept me grounded. Tonight it felt heavier. A man I vaguely recognized leaned toward her, murmuring something I couldn't catch. She touched his elbow as she laughed, head tipping back, a little too relaxed for someone who just accidentally disrupted the program. The speaker tried to recover, shuffling the damp pages into a new stack. I offered to fetch fresh copies, but she waved me off before he could answer. "It's fine," she said brightly, slipping back into the crowd. The tone wasn't reassurance, it was closure. The moment had served its purpose and we were moving on. I stayed where I was, listening to the chatter swell again. From across the room, I saw her pause in conversation with a woman in a green dress. Her hand went to the chain at her neck, fingers brushing over the small pendant she only wore to events like this. I'd bought it for her years ago, back when gifts were instinct, not strategy. Her eyes flicked toward me then, quick, unreadable, and just as quickly away. The man beside her laughed at something she said, leaning in. The brass key pressed harder against my palm. Something about the sequence, the spill, the line, the way she immediately repositioned herself in the room sat wrong. It was all too tidy, too framed. When she finally rejoined me, she slid a fresh drink into my hand without a word. Her smile was warm enough to fool anyone not paying attention. I sipped, not because I wanted it, but because holding the glass kept my other hand anchored in my pocket, wrapped around that key. For the rest of the night, I found myself checking the weight of it every few minutes, as if the metal could tell me what had just shifted. It didn't, but I knew the balance had changed. 2 days after the rooftop mixer, she started leaving the house before sunrise. At first, she called it an early yoga block, something about wanting the quiet of the studio before the mid-morning rush. I didn't argue. We'd both learned that the easiest way to keep the peace was to treat explanations like closed doors. You knock once, and if it doesn't open, you walk past. But I noticed the small things. Her gym bag was heavier than usual. Not bulging, but weighted, the kind of weight that came from more than just a mat and a water bottle. A pair of shoes she didn't wear for yoga disappeared from the closet. She de-changed her hair tie from the wide elastic bands she'd worn for years to thin black ties that looked new. She still synced her calendar with mine technically. The blocks were there, but instead of morning class or client lunch, the entries were stripped down to vague placeholders. Meeting, catch up, errand. No locations, no notes. The first real jolt came on a Thursday. I reached for my keys before heading to work and felt the absence immediately. The vintage brass key wasn't on the ring. The others were there: house, car, office, but the small, worn one was gone. I checked the entry table, the kitchen counter, the top of my dresser. Nothing. When I asked her about it that evening, she tilted her head as if considering the question too long. "I haven't seen it," she said, and her voice carried that careful balance between casual and clipped. Then she smiled, a short, polite smile, and went back to scrolling her phone. By Saturday morning, it was back, sitting in the ceramic bowl by the front door as though it had never left. She didn't mention it, and I didn't ask. The metal felt cooler than usual in my hand, and for the first time the key didn't carry the comfort of my father's memory. It felt like a question. Her schedule shifted further over the next week. Evenings used to mean dinner together or at least a check-in before bed. Now she was running over on errands, or helping a friend sort out something that never seemed to resolve. She'd arrive home with the faint trace of unfamiliar perfume layered over her own, not strong, just enough to make me pause in the hallway as she brushed past. One night, I heard the front door close well after midnight. She padded into the bedroom, set her phone face down on the nightstand, and climbed into bed without a word. Her breathing slowed in minutes. I stared at the outline of the brass key hanging from my keyring on the dresser, catching the glow from the streetlight outside. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but the key had been gone once. That was enough to keep my mind turning over every shift in her routine, every missing detail, every new hole in a schedule that used to feel predictable. The quiet between us wasn't tension exactly, it was something else. Like the pause before an answer you're not sure you want to hear. And in that pause, the brass key sat against my hip, heavier every time I carried it. We said yes to dinner with her coworkers because no had started to mean trouble. The place was narrow and loud. She took the inside seat. I got the chair that wobbled. Names blurred until Noah arrived. Handshake like he was late to something. Easy familiarity as he slid in beside her. Conversation ran through conference gossip and a keynote that fizzled. I smiled when required and let the noise skim past. The brass key in my pocket kept making its small case for attention. Midway through appetizers, Noah lifted his glass toward her. "Still catching up on sleep after your little weekend away, huh?" he said, tossed like a paper plane meant to drift and vanish. It didn't. Her eyes cut left me, then back. "Which weekend?" she asked, tone soft, almost bored. Noah's grin stuttered. "You know," his hand circled, searching runway. "The coastal thing." "The coastal thing," she repeated with a smile, then turned to the woman across from us. "Did your flight ever get rebooked?" The topic evaporated, replaced with relief. Only the air stayed altered. Noah's knee bounced under the table. When the mains arrived, she slid her phone face down and without looking set the brass key beside it. Not mine, but identical. Then I realized it was mine. She must have lifted it when I'd hung my coat. She spun it once, metal catching pendant light, then stilled it with her nail. "You still carry this relic," she said, casual for the group, aimed at me. "It doesn't open anything here," I said. "Habit, not sentiment." She smiled as if I'd admitted to keeping ticket stubs. "You and your keepsakes." The table offered a neutral chuckle. I pocketed the key and traced its edges. I tried it on every lock at home the week before, front door, back door, desk drawer. Nothing. It belonged to some other door. By dessert, she glanced toward the entrance whenever it opened. Noah checked his watch, then the window's reflection. When the bill came, she reached first. "I've got this," she said, card already on the tray. "Company treat?" someone asked. "Something like that," she said, eyes on the server. Outside, winter cut conversation to essentials. We said good night at the curb. She took my arm, more arranging optics than affection. Noah raised two fingers in a wave and stayed planted, as if waiting for a sign that didn't arrive. In the car, she warmed her hands over the vents and studied the fog she drew on the window. "You okay? You were quiet," she said. "I was listening," I said. "To what?" She kept her eyes on the circle. "How people correct themselves mid-sentence." She gave a small laugh. "You and your detective moods." The key tapped my thigh at the next red. I replayed the spin of it under those lights, the word coastal hovering with no safe place to land. I didn't ask for proof or itineraries. First clues are built to be deniable. They invite you to overreach so later they can call you dramatic. At home, she moved through rooms turning on lamps. I set my keys in the bowl and watched the brass one settle on top. It looked smaller than it had at the table, like the room wanted to shrink the question. "Come to bed?" she asked from the hallway. "In a minute," I said. She nodded and vanished down the hall, leaving a trace of citrus that didn't belong to the house. I stood in the entry and listened. The quiet wasn't empty anymore. It had a shape, like a key turning somewhere I couldn't see. 3 nights later, the sound that woke me wasn't loud, more like the soft double click of a lock turning against expectation. I lay still, listening for the follow-up creak of hinges. It came slow, like whoever was moving didn't want to be heard. I padded to the study and opened the feed from our entryway camera. The timestamp showed 12:47 a.m. The lens caught the front door easing open, her silhouette stepping into frame. She wasn't fumbling for her keys, she already had one in her hand, not her own set, the brass key. She slid it into the inside bowl before kicking off her shoes. Her head turned just enough for the camera to catch the faintest smile, relieved maybe, before she stepped aside. That's when a second shadow crossed the edge of the frame. Taller. He didn't come in, just lingered in the threshold until the door closed between them. She didn't notice the red glow in the corner, our camera's silent record of the moment. The next morning, she moved around the kitchen with her usual choreography. Coffee poured, phone angled away from me on the counter. She asked if I wanted eggs, as if eggs could plaster over whatever was now fixed in the footage. By lunch, the other shoe dropped, only it was digital. A text from my bank flagged 2 large withdrawals from our joint account, both processed just after 1 a.m. The amounts weren't ruinous, but they were deliberate, rounded, clean numbers that suggested planning. That was the first time the secondary pattern came into focus. This wasn't only about her absences or the key. Something financial was moving beneath it. That evening, I tested her, asked what time she'd gotten in. She didn't look up from her laptop. "Around 11, she said, voice light, no pause between the lie and the click of her next keystroke. The footage replayed in my head, the brass key turning, the door opening to someone who didn't cross the threshold, her smile before stepping inside. After she went to bed, I pulled the clip from the cloud storage and saved it to an encrypted drive. I stared at the frozen frame, her hand on the key, the shadow in the corner, and realized I wasn't looking for explanations anymore. I was collecting exhibits, and the brass key had officially stopped being a keepsake. It was now evidence. The bank didn't call, it sent a neat alert. Requested change to account permissions. I was between meetings. Routine until I opened the attachment, a scanned form with my name in block letters and a signature that could pass at a glance. New signatory added. Mailing address switched to a PO box I'd never seen. I drove to the branch. The manager's smile said she hoped this was nothing. "We received the notarized package yesterday," she said, turning her monitor, stamps, initials, a notary seal too crisp. In the witness field, a familiar lean to the letters, her handwriting. They brought the physical file. "If there's been an error, we can open an investigation," the manager offered. "Please do," I said. I didn't debate the signature. I requested copies, slid them into a folder, and left. In the car, I placed the brass key across the file. It used to feel like history. Now it felt like a tool someone else had tested while I was busy trusting. At home, she sat at the dining table with her laptop and a mint tea she wouldn't finish. "You're early," she said, not looking up. "Bank glitch," I said, setting the folder down. Her eyes flicked to it and away. That night, I drove to the address tied to the PO box. It sat beside a storage facility we'd rented during a move. The attendant recognized our name. "Unit 214, he said, sliding the ledger forward. I didn't have that key anymore. I had the other, the brass. At the corrugated door, the padlock accepted it like it had been waiting. The shank sprang open with a decisive sound. Inside, banker's boxes, a garment rack with zippered bags, a bin labeled heirlooms in my handwriting. Beneath the lid, the sealed envelope from the attorney who handled my father's estate, still unopened, and a smaller pouch that wasn't mine. New, heavy, I didn't open it. I cataloged, photos, box numbers, dates. The envelope went into my backpack. The brass key went back in my pocket. I relocked the unit and stood long enough to admit the closing click no longer meant security. On the drive back, she called. "Grab milk?" she asked, dishes clinking. "Sure," I said. "Anything else?" A pause. "No." Just that. At the register, I checked our joint account. Another transfer had cleared that afternoon to the mailbox provider. The rhythm was clear now. Nighttime withdrawals, routine paperwork, a unit that opened to my father's name and someone else's plan. After dinner, she dried one glass twice, then a third time, movements neat. "Long day?" she asked without turning. "Productive," I said. She set the towel down carefully. "Good." I waited for the tell, how was the bank, but it didn't come. Silence. Later, I cross-checked the account logs with the entry camera I'd archived. Timestamps aligned with the night she'd used the brass key to come in. Not coincidence, choreography. In bed, she scrolled with her screen dimmed and shoulder angled away. I mapped next steps onto the ceiling, freeze permissions where possible, audit what I couldn't, move sensitive conversations off shared devices, and put the file in hands that see paper, not sentiment, not revenge. Reorganization. Before lights out, I set the brass key on the nightstand between us. It threw a crooked shadow. She glanced once and looked away, as if acknowledging it would grant it authority. We slept facing opposite directions. The house stayed tidy. The story did not. The email hit at 9:12 a.m., subject clean as a blade, inquiry regarding expense irregularities. HR copied legal. An anonymous report claimed I'd routed reimbursements through a personal account and approved my own invoices. I kept my hands flat on the desk until the pulse slowed, then opened my files. Receipts, approvals, vendor lists, dated, indexed, cross-checked against calendars. Order had always been habit, today it was armor. Before replying, I checked the home printer. A skewed page sat in the tray, an internal report template with my name prefilled and self-approved typed across the signature line. I slid it into the folder with the bank copies. At lunch, HR asked for a quick call. I answered with dates and transaction IDs, then sent a packet. No narration, just documentation. By mid-afternoon, two acquaintances texted minutes apart. "Everything okay?" one wrote. The other, "She says you're stressed." The phrases matched too neatly to be spontaneous. I picked up the brass key from the entry table. She stepped in from the patio, phone in hand. "You look pale," she said. "Did we run out of paper?" I asked, glancing at the printer. She laughed. "I printed labels." I pocketed the key and left before the conversation could pretend innocence. That evening, my corporate card pinged for a meal I didn't eat. Declined. Minutes later, a reimbursement draft appeared in the shared drive, labeled with my initials and a receipt that looked almost right. Wrong date, format, vendor misspelled by one letter. I let it sit. While water boiled, she leaned on the counter, scrolling. "Work okay?" she asked. "Busy," I said. "Same," she murmured. "People acting off." In the hallway, I called compliance. I didn't speculate. I listed facts, timestamps, the printer page, the draft's file path. "We'll trace permission," the officer said. "Send what you have." 20 minutes later, a friend forwarded a screenshot from a group chat. Her message: "He's been acting off for months. I'm worried something's wrong with him. If anyone asks, I tried to get him help." Concern phrased like a press release. At 9, I drove to the storage unit. The pouch I hadn't opened sat crooked, as if lifted and replaced. Inside, prepaid cards and a list of small transfers, each under thresholds that trigger flags. On top, a sticky note with my initials and "reconcile" in her handwriting. I photographed everything and put it back. The brass key stuck in the lock when I left, then gave with a reluctant turn. On the way home, I copied the bank forms, the printer page, the prepaid list. She was face down on the couch when I walked in, blanket staged to suggest sleep. Her phone lay on the table, microphone slider on. I set the copies down and watched the icon wake, then sleep. In the bedroom, I placed the brass key on her nightstand instead of mine. A small relocation, a mirror of how she'd moved it through rooms like a prop. Then I set 2 morning meetings, my lawyer and HR, and built a folder labeled Sunday. A still from the entry cam, the notarized account form with her witness line, the printer page with my prefilled name. The confrontation wouldn't be loud. It would be tidy. Before lights out, I watched her breathing settle. The key caught a strip of streetlight and drew a thin line across the wall. If she wanted an audience, she could have one. This time the room would be full of paper, not applause. Sunday morning arrived without ceremony. She was on the couch with a blanket and the news murmuring low, a mug cooling on the table she never used for coffee rings. I set 3 things down in a clean row: the printout from our entry camera, the notarized change form from the bank, and the brass key. I sat opposite her, hands quiet, voice level. "We're going to stay with facts," I said. "No interpretations." She didn't reach for anything yet. Her eyes traveled left to right, landing on the still frame of her at 12:47 a.m., the red timestamp at the top corner, the key in her hand. "This is ridiculous," she said, but the words came out too soft to be a defense. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the hand shook once. I pointed to the time. "You said 11. It felt like 11, she countered, picking up the mug, realizing it was cold, setting it down exactly where it had started. You're reading too much into. Second item, I said, sliding the bank form forward half an inch. New signatory, address changed to a mailbox, my name affixed. Witness line, your handwriting, I've opened an investigation, copies are with counsel. Her jaw worked before her voice caught up. I was helping streamline some things. By streamlining, you mean removing oversight, I said. No heat. The sentence sat between us without leaning either way. She lifted the brass key with 2 fingers like it might stain. You carry this everywhere, I was returning it. It wasn't lost, I said. It opened Unit 214 yesterday. You remember the unit? A pause. We used it during the move. And afterward, I said. You left a pouch with prepaid cards and a list marked with my initials. Also yesterday, an anonymous report at work claimed I'd routed reimbursements. Our home printer is suddenly interested in HR templates. Tiny errors, but errors. She exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath in installments. You're building a story that makes you feel in control, she said, voice low, therapeutic. You've been stressed, you're connecting unrelated things. I nodded once as if we were colleagues making schedules. That's why I brought paper. Paper doesn't depend on mood. I tapped the footage. Entry, midnight. The form, witness line. The key, purpose. She leaned back, blanket tightening around her ribs. No one misled you, she said, choosing the word carefully, and I'm not your adversary. You've been distant for months. I tried to fix it. You shut me out. People notice. They worry. They reach out. I let the script finish itself. This isn't about worry, I said. This is staging. The emails to my colleagues. The draft reimbursement in our shared drive with my initials. The printer page with self-approved already typed. I slid a single photocopy across the coffee table. You missed the vendor's spelling. Her mouth opened, then closed. She folded the blanket corners over each other, then smoothed them flat. Her eyes went to the window, found nothing there, returned to the key in her hand. Tell me what you want, she said finally, voice quieter. You want me to apologize for being sloppy. You want me to say I should have checked with you before touching old accounts. I can do that. But this courtroom performance is unnecessary. I don't want anything, I said. I'll be submitting these to the bank, HR, and my attorney. I'm also ending our financial overlap effective today. She laughed once short, airless. You're overreacting. I'm reorganizing, I said. There's a difference. Silence bridged the room. The news on the TV shifted topics without asking permission. She placed the brass key back on the table, not quite where it had been, a half-inch off the alignment I'd made. We can talk about this later, she said, defaulting to delay. This is later, I said. I'm finished talking. She stared at the camera still again, as if a new meaning might bloom if she looked long enough. When none did, she reached for her phone, thumb hovering above the screen in that indecisive way people get when their usual messages stop working. I stood, gathered the papers into a folder, and left the key where it lay, visible, ordinary, no longer sentimental. At the doorway I paused. There will be emails, I said. They'll be concise. She swallowed, nodding as if we'd scheduled a repainting. Okay. I carried the folder to the study, the house steady around me. The scene behind me flattened into paperwork and a small, inert piece of metal. No shouting, no exit lines, just a line drawn where it needed to be. We had finally switched from performance to record. The first cracks didn't sound like breaking. They sounded like silence. Group threads that once lit her phone at midnight began showing only seen markers and no replies. The woman in marketing who used to send her curated event invites quietly removed her from the guest lists. A dinner with the crew was postponed, then postponed again until it vanished entirely. I didn't interfere. I didn't repeat the confrontation to anyone. I simply sent the relevant files, camera still, bank form, storage unit log to the people who needed to see them. My attorney, the bank's fraud team, HR. Each packet was a clean transaction. No adjectives, no speculation. The joint account split in under a week. The investment portfolio moved to a trust under my sole authority. The forged documents, notarized and timestamped, were archived with a note that read simply, "Do not destroy." She didn't ask where the brass key had gone. It now sat in a lockbox with other artifacts. My father's watch, a photograph from a summer I no longer romanticized, the sealed inheritance envelope. When I opened the box for the first time in years, the key didn't feel heavy anymore. It just felt finished. Her attempts to pivot were visible. An online post about navigating change drew fewer than a dozen likes, most from strangers. A photo at a wine bar with a caption about real friends tagged no one. I saw her tilt the phone toward the light, check the shot, and post anyway. One afternoon, a mutual acquaintance forwarded me a message from her. "He's different now. Doesn't even try to be civil. I think he's unraveling." The recipient hadn't replied. They had sent it to me instead. At the gym she once treated like a second office, I heard she'd been removed from a private group chat. Someone told me in passing, like it was neighborhood gossip. I nodded, no comment. She began spending more time at home, moving through rooms as if the furniture might remind her how it used to feel. The blanket on the couch stayed folded now. The coffee mugs went unused. Even her voice seemed to ration itself, stripped of the performative brightness it once carried. I noticed the shift in her eyes when she asked simple questions. "You heading out? Will you be late?" They weren't checkpoints anymore. They were probes, small attempts to measure how far she'd been pushed outside the frame. When the official letter arrived from the bank confirming the investigation into the signature, I placed it on the kitchen counter without a word. She didn't pick it up. She just walked around it like an obstacle. Within weeks, her circle had thinned to the point where she stopped pretending. Evenings that once echoed with speakerphone calls now held only the low hum of the fridge. She kept the TV on for background noise but rarely watched. The last time I saw her glance toward the brass key was in passing, her eyes catching on the lockbox as I slid it into a drawer. No request to see it. No attempt to explain. Just a quiet acknowledgement of something no longer hers to touch. In the end, she hadn't lost an argument or a fight. She'd lost her audience, and without them, the performance had nothing to stand on.